Chapter 10. Red and Yellow Roses. Do you realize that the child born in 1920 will never know war? Miss Dexter asked. It was morning, and the Suffs were cooking oatmeal over the tiny cook stove at the end of the tourist car while the car changed trains at Chattanooga. Since the Suffs had rented the whole car to go to Nashville in, they didn't have to get off and change trains at the junction points. Instead, the car itself was unhitched from one train, rolled into a siding, and hitched up to another train. The Great War that ended in 1918 was mankind's last war, Miss Dexter went on. We have a League of Nations now. More than 20 countries have joined it already. In the future, all difficulties between countries will be arbitrated by an international court of justice. Outside on the platform, a newsboy called, "Extra! Russians surround Warsaw! Riots in Ireland! English impose martial law!" Violet wondered why Miss Dexter was able to imagine such a perfect world and not imagine a place for Myrtle in it. She got up and went over to the stove. Miss Kelly was glopping oatmeal into tin bowls. "Can I have some to take to Myrtle, please?" Violet asked. "Here you go." Miss Kelly handed her a bowl of thick gray oatmeal. Then she reached into a box and heaped a liberal handful of raisins on top. "Better give her some extra. Injustice makes a girl hungry." Violet had to get off the train in order to find the car Myrtle was in. They were no longer connected. Everything was being rearranged so new trains could be assembled to head to Nashville and other cities from the junction point here in Chattanooga. She found Myrtle standing on a platform on the other side of the tracks, in a knot of colored people who were waiting to get into the Jim Crow car to Nashville. Violet hurriedly told Myrtle about what had happened the night before, but there was no time to discuss what might have become of Mr. Martin, because Violet was supposed to get back to the suffragist car before it moved. "Anyway, I'll see you in Nashville," she said, and hurried away to eat her own breakfast. As she was crossing the tracks, she saw a woman carrying a basket stumble and fall. Violet hurried over to help the woman up. She was tall and angular and bony, and Violet saw with embarrassment, in an interesting condition. Violet could feel her face burn. Ladies who were about to have babies, at least as soon as this woman seemed about to have a baby, usually stayed at home. Violet picked up the lady's basket and also a scrap of black cloth that had fallen on the tracks. "Let me carry this for you," she suggested. "Thank you, child." The woman put her hand on the small of her back and winced painfully. "I'm just going over to the platform to set down. Goodness, that hurt. Doesn't seem to have done any harm to the little one, though. He's still kicking away." Embarrassed by this forthright talk, Violet carried the basket and the cloth across the tracks and up onto the platform. It was a picnic basket, but it looked to her like there were folded clothes in it. The woman sat down painfully on a bench, still holding her back. "Thank you, child. Just put that down right there. That's my son's uniform. They're sending him home from France. He's supposed to be shipped to Chattanooga today." Violet thought that was a funny way of putting it, and then she looked at the piece of black cloth in her hand, and a thought struck her. "Is your son... did he..." "Yes," said the woman. "Put that on my arm, would you, dear? It's supposed to be my mourning." The war had ended almost 2 years ago, but American soldiers' bodies were still being shipped home from France. It was a slow process, apparently. Violet shook out the black cloth and folded it diagonally, then again to make an armband. She wrapped it around the woman's gray calico sleeve. She could see in the seam that the calico had once been dark blue, but it was faded and worn whisper thin from many washings. She tied the armband neatly. "Thank you. Ow!" The woman winced and put her hand on her belly, and Violet looked at her worried. The woman's face was drawn and gray, and a strand of gray hair hung damply down from under her straw hat. Violet had never understood the phrase hatchet-faced before, but now she did. The woman looked as though her face had been cut out of a block of wood with a hatchet. It was all sharp, hard angles. "Are you going to be all right?" Violet asked. "I don't know," said the woman. "You know, child, if men knew how much work it is having babies, I'm not sure they'd be quite so willing to start wars and have our babies blow each other up." "My brother was in France, too," Violet said. "But he came back," she added apologetically, "with shell shock. He never talks anymore." The gray lady nodded. "I hope the good Lord will grant this is my last one," she said, resting both hands on her swollen belly, "and that no one dreams up a war to take this one away from me." Violet was just about to repeat what Miss Dexter had said, that the human race had outgrown war, when a barefoot newsboy thrust a newspaper at them and hollered, "Extra! Russians surround Warsaw! Poland's under siege! Warsaw to fall by the weekend!" Miss Dexter was wrong, Violet thought, about a lot of things. "If you could vote," Violet said, "then you'd be able to vote against wars." Vote? The woman looked as surprised as if Violet just suggested she tap dance. "My husband would never allow that." Violet was about to answer when a loud clang made her look up, and she saw that the Suff's tourist car was being hitched onto a train. "Excuse me," she cried. "That's my train. Goodbye." She waved and hurried to clamber back aboard before they left without her. As the train pulled out, Violet looked back. She could see the hatchet-faced woman sitting beside her basket, an angular gray figure growing smaller in the distance, until the train rounded a curve and she disappeared. Violet wondered what it would be like to be waiting for your son to come home from France in a box. She thought about the woman giving birth to her son. Violet's mother had told her that babies were brought by a stork, but Flossie had given Violet a different explanation that sounded only slightly less unlikely. And then changing his diapers and teaching him table manners and sending him off to school and making beef tea for him when he was sick, and then being told by the government that she had to send him off to France so that he could come home in a box. The more Violet thought about it, the angrier she got. Suddenly Violet understood why all these women were riding to Nashville on a train. It was so that women could never again have to sit by in silence while men made decisions they didn't like. Whether it was father deciding that Chloe couldn't go to college, or the government deciding that people's sons had to go fight in France, whether they wanted to or not. The train pulled into a small station, a flag stop. The little covered platform was a jumble of trunks, porters, and valises. Men and women in stiff-looking best clothes milled about, waiting for the train doors to open. Another newsboy, who looked about 8 years old, was hawking papers, screaming at the top of his lungs, "Riots! Riots in Ireland!" Then, when that didn't attract any customers, "Tigers beat Yankees!" Miss Dexter stood up and waved out the open window. "Paper!" she called. The boy came over and handed the paper through the window. Violet could smell the fresh ink. Miss Dexter dropped 3 pennies into his outstretched hand. The train doors opened and a few people went down the steps onto the wooden platform. Violet stared. If she had known better, she would have sworn one of the people who got off the train was Mr. Martin. She looked again. It was Mr. Martin! But how was that possible? Mr. Martin had jumped off a completely different train the night before. She hardly had time to wonder before she noticed someone was following Mr. Martin. Or that's what it looked like, anyway. It wasn't one of the agents from last night, but the man wore a starched collar. Of course, most men did, and he walked with a speed and a sense of purpose that seemed out of place at a railroad platform. Violet sprang to her feet. She started up the aisle toward the exit. Maybe there was time before the train left to warn Mr. Martin he was being followed. She was in the vestibule when the train started moving. She pushed at the exit door, but it wouldn't open. She gave it a hard push, and it came open, just as a hand grabbed Violet from behind. "Let me go!" She hit at whoever was holding her. On the platform, she saw a small, colored girl running toward Mr. Martin. She couldn't see if it was Myrtle. The train was already picking up speed, and the station was soon out of sight. The conductor let her go. "I don't know what you're playing at, missy," he said disagreeably, "but you're a Nashville passenger, and to Nashville you're going." Violet hadn't wanted to get off, only to make sure Mr. Martin knew he was being followed. But it was no business of the conductor's. "I can get off the train if I want to," she said angrily. "Why would you want to?" the conductor said. "You're paid through to Nashville." He opened the door to the suffragist car. "Now get back to your seat, miss." In Nashville, an army of women greeted the train, their arms full of flowers. They swarmed among the men and women getting off the train, thrusting yellow and red roses at them. Violet stepped off onto the platform, holding the small bundle that contained her spare clothes. The train had pulled into a huge train shed with a high, soaring roof that covered all of the rows of tracks and platforms. Violet had never seen anything like it, but she didn't have time to study it. She looked along the train, searching for the colored car. There it was, all the way at the back. Violet hurried over to where the colored men, women, and children were getting down from the two exits, carrying valises. She watched every single person get off the colored car, but she didn't see Myrtle. So it must have been Myrtle who had chased after Mr. Martin this morning. And then what happened to them? Had the Palmer agent caught Mr. Martin? If he had, then what would happen to Myrtle? Violet paced anxiously back and forth on the platform, staring at the train and willing it to produce Myrtle. But it didn't, of course. Violet didn't know what to do. She and Myrtle had run away together. It was a joint project, and it felt wrong to have gotten separated from her. Besides, she was older than Myrtle and ought to have looked after her better. She went into the train station worrying. The station was even fancier than the one in Washington, though not as big. It had a high, arched stained glass ceiling and mosaic tiles on the floor. A woman with a basket of red roses assailed Violet. "Wear a red rose," she commanded, smiling sweetly and holding one out to Violet. Violet took it uncertainly. "How much are they?" She didn't want to buy one, but wasn't sure how to say no politely. "They're free, dear. We just want everyone to wear a rose to show support for the cause." "Oh, thank you." The stem was wrapped in paper, with a long pin like a hat pin through it. The woman helped Violet pin it to her collar of her dress. Violet's eyes wandered over to a set of windows at the side of the grand room, which had a sign on them that said, "Colored Waiting Room." "There," said the woman. "Now you look lovely. Where are you staying, dear?" With my sister," said Violet. "A group of suffragists, from the train and some who had greeted it, and joined arms in the middle of the mosaic floor, and were doing a little dance, singing. Oh dear, what can be the matter? Oh dear, what can the matter be? Oh dear, what can the matter be? Women are wanting to vote. Women have husbands they are protected. Women have sons by whom they're directed. Women have fathers, they're not neglected. Why are they wanting to vote? Violet did not see Miss Dexter in the circle, but she wouldn't mind losing her, she who had worn thin on better acquaintances. She didn't see Miss Kelly anywhere. "I'm Miss Charlotte Rowe," the woman said, extended her hand. "Miss Violet Mayhew," said Violet, shaking hands. "Is your sister staying with us at the Hermitage Hotel?" Miss Rowe said. "I don't recognize that name, Mayhew. Or is your sister a married lady?" "No, she's not married," said Violet. "I'm surprised she didn't meet you at the station." "She didn't know what train I was coming on," Violet said, which wasn't exactly a lie. "Well, come along with me to the Hermitage," said Miss Rowe. "We'll get it all settled there." Violet could think of no better plan. She was worried about Myrtle, and about Mr. Martin, of course, but she might be just moments away from finding Chloe at last. Chloe would know how to go about finding Myrtle. Chloe would make everything all right. Violet followed Miss Charlotte Rowe, who handed her a basket of red roses to another lady, and said that she was leaving. They went out to a darkening city street, lit at intervals by globe-shaped street lamps. A tired-looking horse clopped along, pulling a wagon with Overton and Bush ice painted on the side. They crossed the street, stepping around horse manure and over streetcar tracks, and turned down another street. They passed movie theaters and vaudeville theaters and drug stores, which, even though they were closed, advertised the fact that they had soda fountains and fountains formed of electric light bulbs blinking on in succession to look like steaming water. Well, sort of like it. Violet was surprised to see such a lively, modern city after the quiet towns and vast wooded mountains they had passed through on the train. Unfortunately, Nashville also seemed to be a very hot place, even at night. Violet could feel sweat trickling down her back inside her undervest. "I know it looks quiet," said Miss Rowe. "This is the still before the storm, as they say. There's a battle brewing that's unlike anything the South has seen since the Civil War." She smiled grimly. "I'm from up north, as I gathered you are too, Miss Mayhew." "Yes, Pennsylvania," said Violet. "A state we've fought long and hard for. Well, we have a battle on our hands here, Violet. The other side is pouring every effort into Tennessee. They've set in some of their most unscrupulous. Ah, here we are." The Hermitage Hotel was 10 stories high and mobbed, the crowd pouring out the grand entryway onto the street. Violet started toward the entrance, but Miss Rowe pulled her arm. "The ladies' entrance is around the side, Violet." They went around the corner, under the vertical sign that reached up the side of the building and spelled out Hermitage in electric light bulbs. They went in through the much smaller ladies' entrance, then down a hallway and past the elevators to the lobby. There was a crowd of men and women around the elevators, and a lady in a pink satin dress called out, "Charlotte, come here a minute." Miss Rowe went to the lady, and Violet wandered on into the lobby. The lobby was as crowded as the train station had been. Violet looked up at a high stained glass skylight, which was dark now, set in an elaborately decorated ceiling, with plaster bosses and garlands of fruit. There was a balcony, and people crowded along the railing, looking down at the people in the lobby. Violet couldn't hear what anyone was saying. The babble around her was too loud, with hundreds of voices echoing off the marble floors and walls. In fact, she was getting an awful headache. Violet looked around and found the registration desk. She made her way through the crowd of people in yellow roses and red roses and past an old man wearing what she thought was a Confederate Army uniform. The desk clerk didn't seem to notice her. "I beg your pardon," she ventured. "No rooms," said the desk clerk, looking up. I have no rooms left, small or large, with or without conveniences. No rooms for suffs, no room for antis, no rooms for the Southern Women's Rejection League, the Men's Ratification Committee, the Tennessee Constitutional League, the National Women's Party, the League of Women Voters, the Confederate Widows Society, or the Women's Christian Temperance Union. I'm not with any of those, Violet said hurriedly. I was wondering if... Could you tell me if my sister is staying here? A Miss Mayhew. Suffs are on the 3rd floor, the clerk went on, seeming not to have heard her. Antis are on the 7th and 8th. Anti-headquarters are on the mezzanine. Miss Carrie Chapman Catt and Mr. Joe Hanover are on the 3rd floor, although not, of course, he sniffed delicately, together. Miss Josephine Anderson Pearson is on the 7th floor. Anti's hospitality suite is on the 8th floor. People who take both the anti and the suff side? Mr. Walker! Violet turned. A woman was calling to a man in a black suit who seemed anxious to avoid her. She called his name again, and he turned reluctantly to face her. She looked very angry. Who got to you? She demanded. How much did they pay you, Mr. Walker? Was it 30 pieces of silver? Silence fell in the crowded room. Everyone drew back and watched. Mr. Walker put his hand to his throat and took a step back, looking shocked. Was it the Louisville and Nashville Railroad that bought you off, Speaker Walker? The woman hissed. How dare you? Mr. Walker jammed his Panama hat on his head, spun on his heel, and stalked out of the hotel. People started talking, again, a little nervously. Huh, said the desk clerk. That's the Speaker of the Tennessee House, Seth Walker. He was one of the Suff's strongest supporters. If he's turned coat, I don't see how they can win. You mean he changed sides? Said Violet. So it would seem, said the desk clerk. Interesting. He dipped his pen in ink and made a little note on his desk blotter, which Violet saw was covered with tally marks. Is there a Miss Mayhew staying at the hotel? She repeated. The clerk opened up his ledger, and ran his finger down it. No, I don't have any Mayhew. Is she a suff or an anti? There you are, Violet. Miss Rowe came bustling up. Did you find your sister? She's not here, said Violet, feeling desperate. She had lost Myrtle and Mr. Martin, and she couldn't find Chloe. She was completely alone. She felt like crying. Miss Rowe looked unconcerned. Squeeze her into one of our rooms for tonight, Frankie. Put her in with Miss Eucadrill. There's an extra bed in there. Violet, come down to the mezzanine once you get settled. You can meet some of the really important leaders in our movement, like Miss Josephine Anderson Pearson. Oh, there's Mr. Byrne. I must speak to him. Excuse me. Violet looked back at the desk clerk. He ran his finger down a page, frowning. I'll put you in with Miss Eucadrill, then. It's room 907, on the top floor but one, just below dancing. He turned to the hook-covered board behind him and selected a key with a brass tag and handed it to Violet. Elevators around the corner.